opportunity for Nova Scotians. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now recognize the Deputy House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And that concludes our business for the day, and I'm happy to turn it over to the Government House Leader.
Recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you. Excuse me, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I want to thank everybody for their debate today. It was very interesting, very lively. We ask you now, Madam Speaker, the House to now rise to meet from the hours of noon to 10 p.m. tomorrow. After the orders of the day and question period, we will call private local bills, Bill number 57, government bills for second reading, Bills 71 and 73. And if we're fortunate enough and get permission, if we report any bills back for Committee of the Whole House on bills, maybe we can get unanimous consent. We'll move forward with those. But with that said, Madam Speaker, we ask the House to now rise.
The motion is that the House does now rise to meet again tomorrow, May the 3rd, between the hours of noon and 10 p.m. Is the House ready for the question? All in favour say aye. Those opposed, nay. The motion is carried. We've now reached the time of late debate, and I would now read the debate under Rule 5.5 as submitted by the Honourable Member for Truro Bible Hill. Late debate reads, therefore, be it resolved that the irresponsible Liberal proposal to deregulate electricity markets would be a disastrous experiment at the expense of Nova Scotians. I now recognize the Honourable Member for Truro Bible Hill.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, my colleagues. Thank you. Madam Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to rise this evening to speak to the irresponsible proposal brought forward from the Liberal caucus. Madam Speaker, quite simply, the Liberal caucus suggestion would ensure large companies earn greater profits, while Nova Scotia ratepayers would pay even more for electricity. I would suggest, Madam Speaker, that the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition would like to deregulate the industry and leave Nova Scotia ratepayers at the mercy of an extremely volatile market. Madam Speaker, apparently the Leader of the Official Opposition would like to follow in the steps of Alberta and Ontario and experiment with electricity deregulation on the backs of Nova Scotians and on the backs of our children. But, Madam Speaker, I would like to table a report by the RBC Dominion Securities from 2001, and I would like to read an excerpt from this report, Madam Speaker, which says, Alberta is further advanced in the process of deregulating its electrical industry than any other Canadian province. In unnerving similarity to California's experience, this process has resulted in Alberta's power prices increasing from amongst the lowest in the world to amongst the highest in North America. And, Madam Speaker, I will table that. Madam Speaker, this is the same proposal being put forward by the Liberal caucus. The Leader of the Official Opposition would like to see Nova Scotia participate in a similar experiment which would see electricity prices soar to unthinkable levels. My government has a plan, Madam Speaker, that makes sense. My government has a plan that will ensure stable energy prices for all Nova Scotians for many years to come. And let me say, Mr. Speaker, my government understands the burden of rising electricity prices on the pocketbooks of Nova Scotians. We really do. And I personally understand the burden of these rising prices on the pocketbooks of my constituencies of Truro Bible Hill. That's why, when we took office, we removed the HST on energy, and we legislated some of the most aggressive renewable energy targets in the world. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I am very proud of that fact. Mr. Speaker, we all know that the cost of coal keeps rising each year, and Nova Scotians end up paying more for electricity because of that. But the Liberals' proposal to deregulate electricity markets would definitely not address this. Mr. Speaker, our plan is about making life better and more affordable for all Nova Scotians, which includes protecting our environment and doing our part to stop global warming, while providing a much healthier, greener, and affordable future for our children and our children's children. You see, Mr. Speaker, renewable electricity prices do not go up over time in the same way that coal has, and will continue to. Coal prices have already risen 75% in the last 5 years, Mr. Speaker. I mean, that's hard to believe. So why wouldn't this government be doing everything we can to try to convert to renewable energy sources as quickly as possible? Moving towards local renewable energy sources will help stabilize energy prices in the future, Mr. Speaker, and protect consumers from the volatility of world markets and energy supply shortages. Unlike the Liberal proposal, Mr. Speaker, our plan is about ensuring fair and stable energy prices for all Nova Scotians today, tomorrow, and for years to come. Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, the members opposite in both parties are not as familiar as I am with everyday life in the United States, because I have lived and worked in 3 different cities in the U.S. over the years: Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles, California. In fact, I personally experienced the now infamous rolling blackouts in California that were a direct result of the privatization and deregulation of electricity. I have actually personally heard tapes that were recorded by laughing workers working for the power company as they turned off the power for hundreds of thousands of people, and one of them laughingly said, "Yes, that's right. I guess Granny won't get to heat up her oatmeal this morning." Pretty terrible stuff, isn't it? I think we can all agree to that. So perhaps, Mr. Speaker, the members opposite are also not familiar with some of the politics that have gone on in Ontario. Some of them are too young to remember some of that. However, I am, Mr. Speaker, old enough because I attended York University in Toronto in the 1970s, and I lived in that city for many years. So I was both a homeowner and a taxpayer. So I paid great attention to what was happening in Queen's Park. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, the leader of the official opposition perhaps he has not had the opportunity to discuss electricity deregulation with his Liberal colleague, the Honourable Dalton McGuinty of Ontario. Therefore, I wish to table an excerpt from an Ontario provincial government question period. And it's a quote from the Honourable Dalton McGuinty. And I will first read it in this House. Yes, please. Thank you. The quote is, "Now that Bay Street recognizes it, now that Main Street recognizes it, now that this is a broad consensus right across the country that this has been one of the most glaring examples of gross mismanagement and incompetence, why not admit it? Deregulation is dead. The market is dead. Your experiment has been an abject failure." I table that. Well, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that that this government will not sit on the sidelines and allow this Liberal proposal to deregulate electricity cripple our future. We will not entertain an ill-conceived plan which will empty our purses and threaten our environment. In my humble opinion, Mr. Speaker, this is a grossly irresponsible proposal which has already proven to be a disastrous experiment in many other jurisdictions, as I've already mentioned. Our approach, Mr. Speaker, is not only to stabilize electricity prices and reduce our environmental footprint, but our approach is also to create more good jobs and to plan stable energy prices and affordable energy prices for the good people of Nova Scotia well into the future. We have a plan, Mr. Speaker, unlike the leader of the official opposition and his party, whose only plan seems to be to criticize and deny every progressive move this government makes. We have a plan, Mr. Speaker, and it's working. And guess what? We are just getting started. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I now recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the NDP is just getting started, bankrupting companies with higher energy rates and driving people into the poorhouse where they can't afford food. The fact of the matter is, the Liberal caucus has never once suggested deregulation, and in fact has always opposed deregulation. Never once. We actually, Mr. Speaker, we've actually gone through the complete Hansard record of multiple terms when Liberal members who are long gone have been in this House. Never once have the Liberals suggested deregulation. Where this came from is the Premier decided that the piece of legislation, which is supported by the member for Halifax-Chebucto and Halifax Centre, which actually brings better regulation and more regulation, he decided to say, oh, well, that's deregulation. Never once has any Liberal member of the Nova Scotia legislature supported deregulation. The only party in Nova Scotia reducing regulations and abdicating their responsibility over power rates is the NDP. The fact of the matter is the NDP have allowed power rates in this province to increase by over 20%. They may have taken the HST off electricity by taking $28 million off, but they added a new tax that has dragged $40 million out of the pocketbooks of Nova Scotians when they said during the election they would never do that. It's this party, this NDP, that is driving people to have to choose between electricity and food. It is this party is the only one demanding proper regulation of Nova Scotia Power and the electricity market. Never once have we suggested deregulation of the electricity market, and the fact that the NDP would suggest it shows just how bad their research is and explains why they break one promise after another, because they don't know how to govern this province, and in 12 months' time they will not even be sitting on that side of the House. That is where we are in Nova Scotia. With a party, we have a premier that didn't even understand that, Mr. Speaker, we had a premier that didn't even understand that the Utility and Review Board didn't feel it had the authority to govern Muskrat Falls. We have a premier that didn't understand that it was his legislation that added a $40 million tax on ratepayers in Nova Scotia. It is this premier that tried to say that a bill which his own party has supported and spoken in favor of is suddenly deregulation, even though in fact the bill, the one-page bill, doesn't remove a single thing from the oversight of Nova Scotia. In fact, one of the parts of that is in fact that it demands that there be oversight by the Utility and Review Board and approval of rates. It doesn't remove one bit of regulation in this province, and the word deregulation has not escaped the lips of the Leader of the Official Opposition or mine. That word has never, ever escaped our lips in the term of us doing it, because we wouldn't do it. We would never do such a thing. The fact of the matter is that it's this party that has shown a complete incompetence when it comes to regulating and understanding electricity issues in this province. At one time, there were members of this party, and I can count them out. There was the member for Timberley Prospect who said that the URB was abdicating its responsibility and wasn't doing proper. There was the member for Halifax-Chebucto who used to go down to power rates when he cared about Nova Scotians. And there were so many of them that thought that Nova Scotia Power was treating Nova Scotians poorly, and they spoke in favor of the legislation the Liberal caucus has proposed. But now, all of a sudden, because they know they're on the ropes and they know that Nova Scotians blame them for higher rates, that is why we now have a province. That is why they now try and slander the official opposition with untruths and things that are blatantly false. I asked the Premier during question period to table a single example. I asked the Premier during question period to table a single example of this caucus advocating for deregulation, and he was unable to do it. In fact, during his answer, he backtracked from saying that we were in favor of deregulation. It's a shame that the NDP decided they had to put this in and then put it in, and then the Premier backtracked before we even got to this debate. Because it kind of threw that out the window, didn't it, Mr. Speaker? You know, that we have a plan for Nova Scotians for rates to ensure that Nova Scotians are treated fairly. We won't spend the next 20 years studying issues while rates skyrocket and people are driven from their homes and businesses choose not to locate here because the power rates are downright unaffordable. We have a plan that will ensure that our hospitals are not crippled by increasing power rates, that our schools are not crippled by increasing power rates, and that jobs don't go elsewhere because the NDP don't understand the impact of electricity rates in this province. Mr. Speaker, this plan is simple, and not one word of it involves deregulation. Not one word. And so if the best that the NDP can come up with is to try and make things up, there's not a Nova Scotian that's going to believe them. The fact of the matter is, we have advocated for the fact that ratepayers should not be paying the executive bonuses of Nova Scotia Power. The NDP refuses to support that. The NDP believes that Nova Scotia Power ratepayers should pay bonuses, not shareholders. The NDP doesn't believe that Nova Scotia Power should be audited because they think they're doing everything just lovely. And I would love to see the Premier campaign on that one. Mr. Speaker, the Premier also sits there and says that he doesn't want green jobs in this province because he doesn't want to give those renewable energy suppliers the opportunity to compete in a regulated market against Nova Scotia Power for customers. He doesn't want companies like Michelin, companies like Stern, which used to be NewPage, companies like Bowater, Acadian Seaplanes. He doesn't want them to be able to choose to generate renewable energy off on other sites and use it on their properties. He doesn't want to allow that because it would remove his control. But the fact is, this is a Premier who is more than willing to stand up. When things are going well, he'll take credit, but when they're going bad, he'll defer it down to the Utility and Review Board, the one organization that he said was treating Nova Scotians poorly when he was in opposition. This is a Premier that will not stand up for anything that he stood up for in opposition. It's one broken promise after another as Nova Scotians suffer under the oppressive regime that sits over there in those benches. And that's why Nova Scotians are looking hard at this and wondering how the NDP can remotely suggest that the Liberal caucus, which has never once advocated for deregulation, would suddenly do that. You know, because we wouldn't do that. We stand by what we said. When we said that the DSM charge, which is now the electricity tax introduced by the NDP, should be paid by shareholders, we stood by that. But the Premier said that 6 days before the election. He said it should be paid for by shareholders, and lo and behold, in the first session after, he was the first one to take $40 million out of the pockets of Nova Scotians. And I might add that that's $12 million more that he's taken from them than they saved from his HST cut. So he didn't tell them that. And then, even of the savings, he talks about the $100 million savings that Nova Scotians are getting from those conservation programs, and forgets to mention the millions of dollars his departments are taking from Efficiency Nova Scotia programs instead of allowing them to go to low-income families and middle-income families and businesses who could use the help in reducing their energy costs. Then the best thing he can say is, well, Liberals are against conservation. When repeatedly we've said we are absolutely in favor of it and we applaud the work of Efficiency Nova Scotia. What we don't applaud is the fact that ratepayers are forced to pay those costs when shareholders should bear the burden. And once upon a time, the Premier believed that too, and he doesn't anymore. Mr. Speaker, there will be a new energy future in this province, and the Liberal caucus is leading that. And the Liberal caucus is leading that under a fully regulated market, under a market that supports green energy and stable prices and honesty with Nova Scotians over energy. Not making up untruths and telling fairy tales that other parties believe in, things that they don't believe in. It's been one thing after another that they try and throw, and none of it sticks, and this is the latest one. Now, I remind you, Mr. Speaker, never once have I, the leader of this party, or any member of this caucus advocated for the deregulation of the electricity market in Nova Scotia. And if they have researchers in that caucus that believe that, it's time to fire them and get new ones.
Thank you. I now recognize the honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What a very spirited debate we have here this evening. I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, this place feels like purgatory to me. You can't get any satisfaction in here. You can't change anybody's minds in here. But in all seriousness, we can talk all we want, debate back and forth, and if anybody is watching this, I'm sure they're seeing this too. It's very difficult to change people's minds. And we've tried to talk about numbers. As soon as we go to numbers, people go to philosophy. And I've suggested, why don't we just put the numbers out on the table? And no question, as the member for Truro-Bible Hill said today, the price of coal has risen. I think she said 70 or 75% in recent years. And I would not dispute that. I would agree with that. And I would also agree that it's probably going to go higher. But there are things that cause commodity prices to drop as well. Look at the price of natural gas, which has dropped from $14 to $2. That kind of a drop means that more people will be demanding natural gas. We're even hearing talk in the province now of trucking natural gas around the province. It's only preliminary talk, but that's a sign if the market's seeing, oh, there's an opportunity, something is cheaper, we can sell it, we can make a profit margin on that. The more natural gas that's purchased, the less coal that will be purchased, which will start to drop the price of coal. My point, Mr. Speaker, is that right now the province is burning 58% of the input to make electricity comes from coal. It's not going to go away anytime soon. And if the renewable target was moved from 20% to 40%, and it's such a good idea, why don't we move it to 100% tomorrow? Why don't we close all the coal plants down in the province? Why don't we stop burning coal completely now? I would suggest to the government, if they feel that strong about it, why don't they do that? Why don't they come out and say that? But the reality they're going to face is that it's not practical, because coal is so much cheaper than the alternatives. And when we start looking at the numbers, yes, coal has risen 75%, but it's still a third of the price of the amount that Nova Scotia Power is required to pay for wind energy. So it's going to have to increase itself, much more to even come close to the cost of wind. Now, we heard the Premier today in question period talking about that when the UARB was here today during public accounts, I'd asked the question, what is the cheapest source for delivering or for generating electricity? And first he said coal, and he said, no, wait, it's hydro. And that's what the Premier mentioned today in question period, but I knew the Premier was going to jump on that. So I asked a follow-up question. I said, well, can you clarify what you mean by hydro? I trust you don't mean Muskrat Falls. And he said, no, I'm not referring to that. And he referenced the Wreck Cove power generation station in Cape Breton. So I guess my point here, Mr. Speaker, since I don't think we're, from the vehement opposition by the party that was accused of suggesting we have deregulation, instead of attacking them for something they claim they have not, that they have not called for, that's why I'm kind of changing my remarks and customizing them a bit. Because of the gentleman that I am. So Mr. Speaker, you know, the point I'm trying to make here is that it feels like I'm in purgatory today, because I know I'm not going to convince the members opposite about the impracticality of just completely leaving coal. And I know the member from Dartmouth East made some comments as well that, you know, we have to believe that climate change is reality and that the world is not flat. And that kind of riled me up a little bit. But you know, I think it's irresponsible when I hear the Premier say things in the province like, you know, we're shackled to fossil fuel prices and we should have got off it 15 years ago. When we know 15 years ago coal was 75% cheaper and it was an even better bargain back then. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't move away from it, but what I'm saying is to just completely move away from it immediately is just not practical. People can't afford that. And at the end of the day, what you would have to do, we'd have to have a movement where we would all have to head for the hills and get back to the land. And you might think that's ridiculous, but I can tell you in Japan right now, where they've shut down nuclear power plants after the earthquakes over there, they don't use air conditioning now in Japan. The citizens have been asked not to use air conditioning, and it gets pretty hot in Japan in the summertime. They also don't have lights turned on in their offices during the daytime because there's such a shortage of energy supply. And if you shut down all the coal plants today in Nova Scotia, that's what we'd be facing decisions like that. Some people, and there was a comment in the throne speech that they were going to light a candle for those in the dark, but we would be in the dark if we completely got off coal right now. And, you know, so if some people may be prepared to head for the hills, but I think most Nova Scotians are not. They appreciate getting up in the morning and flicking a light switch and being able to see what they're doing if they're up early for work. So if we look at Germany, Germany was one of the leaders in the world at looking at renewable energy, drove all kinds of subsidies to it, and now have discovered that it hasn't been such a great idea. They had intentions to close coal plants. They have not closed one coal plant in Germany. Not one. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't aim to do that someday, but we have to be careful. And when we had the UARB here today, you know, we hear talk, well, should never have privatized Nova Scotia Power. You know, maybe not, okay. But the fact is, it's been privatized, so we are where we are. The question becomes, how can we best control that private entity to make sure that it's delivering fair power rates to Nova Scotians? And how can we make sure the decisions they're making are in our best interests? When the government makes a sweeping decision to say, let's go with Muskrat Falls before looking at the cost, or let's switch our renewable goals to go from 20% to 40%, without looking at the impact of that, Mr. Speaker, I think that's irresponsible. And if we want to get ourselves out of, or at least get me out of purgatory, I'd like to see some numbers. And I think we would lose all the philosophy in the debate, and I think we would all realize, Mr. Speaker, that renewable energy is a good thing in time as it improves and it becomes more efficient, but we must be responsible, because we can debate ourselves till we're blue in the face in here, but at the end of the day, most Nova Scotians, pretty much all Nova Scotians, who I look outside the window here, they're the ones that have no say in any of this. Really don't know a lot about it because there's all kinds of misinformation out there. They're the ones that are paying their power bills. And they're the ones that have to live with the decisions we make. So as I close, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that we be responsible in this legislature and from all sides, and that if we want to look towards reducing fossil fuels and moving towards renewable energy, I would ask that we be responsible about it, and that we table numbers in the legislature and let the numbers help to carry the day, because there are economic consequences as well. What good are we, and I think of the paper mill in my area, what good are we if power rates drive that operation out of business and the operation is moved to China, where there are less strict environmental regulations, and where people in China are making our paper for us, and they're polluting the same air there that we're breathing here. So, and yes, somebody has to start somewhere, no question, but we're going to defeat ourselves, because if in that example, if we don't solve the problem because we just export it to China, and we lose our economy, we have less power in the future to make good decisions, because our economy is weaker and we have less of an economy to be able to afford the more expensive renewable energy. With that, Mr. Speaker, I will conclude my remarks.
Thank you, and I want to thank all honourable members for their enthusiastic and charged debate tonight. The time for late debate has now elapsed. We will now stand adjourned to meet again tomorrow at 12 noon till 10 o'clock. We are now adjourned.